What does legendary NASCAR driver Dale Earnhardt, NFL linebacker Brian Cushing, and President Barack Obama have in common? Well, we're traveling from Gettysburg to Malvern Hill and back to tell that story. And it all starts right here at Malvern Hill. And you won't believe how it ends. In July of 1862, a 19-year-old West Point grad, Alonzo Cushing, ends up making his way out here to this place, Malvern Hill. He's with the 4th U.S. Artillery, and he's been with them since he's pretty much graduated from West Point in 1861. He finds himself up and concentrated with the Army of the Potomac for the very first time here at Malvern Hill. And they have an opportunity to sweep the Confederates off of this field and maybe even take it to Richmond. But they don't take that opportunity. And what happens here is a crushing victory by the United States Army against the Confederates, with 250 pieces of artillery lined up along these ridge lines out here, aimed and ready to attack. And they stop the Confederates from having that converging fire that they were looking for. Now, when I come out here, I don't normally go out to this location at Malvern Hill very often, but I'm going to take you over to the place where roughly, I believe, the 4th U.S. Artillery probably entered the field and set up and rotated in and out with the rest of the artillery here on this field. Now, back there is the wayside marker and the big parking lot where you stop for Malvern Hill. And out here, in this open field, just behind where the marker is where I believe the artillery probably set up and rotated in and out. According to the battle maps that I've seen, both the historic maps and the maps coming from the American Battlefield Trust, right back there in that direction, off in those wooded areas where the hill gently comes up and rises, the artillery would have been along this crest here and rotating towards the crew house, which is right over there down at the end of that road. And the crew house is private property today. You can't get in there, but you can get pretty close to it. The 4th U.S. Artillery and Alonzo Cushing was likely here that day, July 1st of 1862, when all hell broke loose and the cannons started to fire back and forth at each other. If you look across the distance there, out there is one of the positions where the Confederate artillery would have been placed. Also off in this direction over here, another section of artillery, which wasn't very successful at hitting this location. And the artillery over here was prepared to the point to when the Confederates started to open fire, they were taking out Confederate artillery pieces and slowing down the converging fire, which made them highly successful here at Malvern Hill. All right. Now we're going to go into some battlefield orientation, the stuff I like the most out here. So right over here we have the West House. And there's a road that runs behind that ridge line there that takes you up into the park. The 4th U.S. Artillery was probably right about here, making its way up, and then eventually would end up over in that area there. And they were facing the Confederates that were coming from this direction. This is the wayside marker and signs here at Malvern Hill, and across the way there is where the Confederate artillery pieces are set up, and a marker over there to indicate the type of firepower that is happening. The Confederates were coming from all along the wood lines inside there, across this open field, all across here, where the road splits over there, back in that direction, and the Confederate artillery pieces were set up on a farm way off in the distance over there, firing and converging in this direction as well. Lee had a plan to converge his fire here to try to knock out some of this artillery before he would put his infantry in. And he knew that this was a tough fight. This was something that he may not be able to pull off, but he had to continue to press the enemy like he'd been doing before. Now, Alonzo Cushing becomes a legend because of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. But out here, he's doing a pretty good job as well. And his commander, the guy that's in charge of all of the artillery, makes note that the artillery out here stopped any advance and broke up any line that was advancing towards them. He made a note of that, which is a pretty big deal. Alonzo Cushing was just a 19-year-old boy, essentially, that was in charge of about 100 men and a couple of cannons out here. So he had a lot of responsibility on his shoulders being such a young person. Across the field, however, the other legend that we're talking about, Dale Earnhardt, he's got an ancestor out here, right over there with the 20th North Carolina. Peter Crawford Earnhardt's out here. That man is about 14, 15 years older than Alonzo Cushing. He's got a family, he's got kids, and he's got a farm back home that he's trying to get back to. A hard scrabble life. It really isn't much, but it's his. He doesn't come from a line of elitists or educated people like Alonzo Cushing. Alonzo Cushing comes from a family with wealth and money and property. And they were able to get him an appointment at West Point. And in those days, a West Point appointment generally was for people with money, wealth, or some kind of a political connection. Peter Crawford Earnhardt doesn't have that. He's coming across these fields here with the shirt on his back and the gun on his side, and that's it. These two families, however, somehow in generations to come will end up in the NFL and NASCAR, and they will go on to create legends themselves. Earnhardt's born in February of 1839, and he is born to a farming family in Cabarrus County. I believe it's the way you say it. And today, I believe it's called Kannapolis, in North Carolina. At the age of 22, he ends up enlisting in 1861 and finds himself in the 20th North Carolina. From there, they end up pushing their way north and end up in the Army of Northern Virginia. This is how Peter Crawford becomes one of the men that's fighting here at Malvern Hill, by enlisting in 1861 and simply just by chance. A lot of men from North Carolina enlist in the Confederate Army, and a lot of them get separated into different directions. Just to give you an example, in Yancey County, North Carolina, multiple units were enlisting at the exact same time. Half of those units ended up in the Army of Tennessee, and the other half would end up being units that were in Gettysburg. Some of the most famous units from Gettysburg, or infamous I should say, because of how many people were lost, killed, or wounded there at Gettysburg. So walking under these trees out here is a bit of a hazard at the crew house. The snow is making its way down and smacking me in the head every chance it gets. I guess hazards of a trail walker. So here in this position, this is where the crew house is. You can see that crew house still exists over there, but it's not park property. The 4th U.S. Infantry is out here, Alonzo Cushing, and he's firing and blazing away. Well, directly in front of me here, not too far down the way from where we're going, Magruder's men are coming up through here. Got Armistead's men out there. Mahone's men are out there. And one young man ends up losing his life here on this field that we talked about in a previous video. And his name was Jemison. And young Jemison is also a famous Civil War soldier, but not for anything spectacular other than the fact that his photo presents a very young, almost angelic looking boy in a military uniform. It was used a lot in the Ken Burns documentary, and people talk about the fate of young Jemison. There was a man that claimed to have seen his death out here. It turned out to be false. The man was never even on the field. But his story was kind of legendary out here in Malvern Hill as well. Now that man back there creates a real legend when he gets to Gettysburg. And I think maybe his age might have something to do with it. Because when he's out here, he's 19. He's young, he's full of fire, he's brave, and by the time he gets to Gettysburg, he's survived a lot. Now it's likely that the 4th U.S. could have possibly been the group that fired the shot that killed Jemison out here on this field. And there was another young man that we talked about in Gettysburg who was fighting for the 18th Virginia coming across this very field too. And he had to lay low to the ground knowing that his own kin was laying on the field dead. And that young man would go on to Gettysburg, and he would actually be at the angle in the same position as Alonzo Cushing attacking that battery on the day of Gettysburg. He would be in the same area when Cushing was there holding his intestines in with his own hands. Now we've walked down to the point, and hopefully you can hear me over the aircraft here. We're in the traffic pattern here. We walked down to the point roughly where Jemison supposedly lost his life, and it's about maybe 2 football fields away from where the cannon fire would have been coming from the 4th U.S. Artillery. So here in a second, I'm going to flip this camera around and I'm going to kind of give you an orientation as to where we're at, where the 4th would have probably been, roughly, and where Jemison and that other soldier we were talking about with the 18th Virginia would have also been across this field. So looking out across this field, in this general area here, this is where the artillery pieces are set up, and possibly the 4th is in this area somewhere, firing in this direction. That's also one of the places where the Confederates came close to the lines. The only time, one time only, but that was the spot. Out in this area here, it's supposed that Jemison lost his life. Also, Armistead's men are coming from back in those woods and coming out across this field. The 18th Virginia is out here. Mahone's men are coming across those fields there as well. And this is the low depression that we talked about in the previous video on Malvern Hill. When I was on the opposite side of the field actually rises up over there where Couch's men were located, and Couch's men would have been right there. They're up on a height with cannons placed forward deployed facing those woods where Jackson's men are coming out. Over here, however, this is not a great place for that. It dips down and it rises back up. The high point on this field is back here, this ridge line. And when you get to these woods, it just drops off. Back here on this other side, it drops off as well. It's almost like a cliff. But this is the most advantageous point for the artillery for the Union soldiers. Malvern Hill's battlefield doesn't have a whole lot of signs out here, but the signs that they have a lot of impact. Like this one here that talks about the farthest advance. It talks about 2 small structures. It says it was used as slave quarters and it stood in this clearing. Some of the fiercest fighting raged around them in the twilight, as men of Paul J. Sims' Confederate Brigade used the buildings for shelter and exchanged short-range fire with counterattacking Union troops. It is unlikely that any organized Confederate formation advanced beyond these cabins. None reached the roaring line of cannon at the hill's crest. When July 2nd dawned, a line of Southern casualties stretched across the field, showing the high water mark of the Confederate advance. And here is Edwin F. Jemison. That was that 17-year-old boy that we're talking about that was killed here near this spot. The photographer for this photograph, right here, stood 100 yards to our right when he took this view. So, off in the woods over here, 100 yards, and he was able to capture the crew house, which was directly in front of him, and then the slave quarters that still existed at that time. To set this battle up, Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army have been fighting what is known as the 7 Days Battles. And their last battle is Glendale. If you take the road that's over there, off in that direction towards the cemetery, Glendale is all over the place. The battlefield is pretty much everywhere out there. It's not protected property. There are places that are protected and wayside markers that you can pull off and read about the battle. But Longstreet and his men had advanced, and Robert E. Lee was headed in this direction, and he thought he saw an opportunity over here to fight. But then when Longstreet and Lee gets together and does a reconnaissance out here to see the force, he realizes he has the entire Union Army out here. they are up and concentrated, and they are headed towards the James River. So instead of backing off and redeploying, he decides to continue the press over here, and he finds two high spots to put his artillery. And he wants to place the artillery in such a position that he can converge the fire, and he's trying to do this in a hurry, and he gets them out there early in the morning. But once he gets them there, the Union Army here, the artillery across the field, is starting to see what's happening, and they take the advantage, and they start firing towards those pieces. Now we have early morning to mid-morning firing coming across this field from both sides. You have infantry making their way up the roads over here, trying to line up to get into position. And even at one point in time, General Jackson had approached another officer about crossing this field after the fight had been on for a while, and he said to him, "Then you had better not do it." Meaning, this is a useless fight. You're just throwing your men into the fire for no reason. And of course, those men were very relieved to hear Jackson say that, because that meant they didn't have to go across this field. Lee thought he had the opportunity here, but what happened was the biggest slaughter possibly in the American Civil War of artillery versus infantry. It was the biggest display of that here at Malvern Hill. The position I'm in right now is one of the artillery positions out here, just out in front of where the Robert E. Lee statue is at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And if you come out to this position here, you'll get a good understanding of how Pickett's charge actually started. Now, off in the distance behind me, right past where this cannon was, or is today, the men from Armistead's brigade were lined up, preparing to go into combat over here. This is how far out they were. The misconception is that the Confederate soldiers actually lined up back there where Robert E. Lee's statue is. The statue itself is supposed to be an indicator of where Lee rode out to speak to his men as they were coming back across this field, and where he uttered those famous words, "It is all my fault." Armistead's men were standing on this ridge where I'm standing right now, just behind these cannons. And they were preparing to walk into something that many of them had probably seen before at a place called Malvern Hill. When the Battle of Gettysburg opened on July 1st, 1863, Lieutenant Alonzo H. Cushing and Battery A, 4th U.S. Artillery, were brought forward as Union forces withdrew through the town. By nightfall, his guns were positioned on Cemetery Ridge, the very center of the Union line. On July 2nd, as the combat raged across the flanks at Little Round Top, the Wheat Field, and Culp's Hill, Cushing's battery held its ground under intermittent fire, supporting infantry who repelled fierce Confederate assaults. His position remained quiet compared to the chaos elsewhere, but everyone sensed the storm was gathering. That storm arrived on July 3rd. At about 1 p.m., Confederate artillery opened a massive bombardment aimed directly at the Union center. Cushing's battery absorbed devastating losses, men killed, horses torn apart, equipment shattered. Amid the explosions, Cushing was struck by shell fragments that tore into his abdomen and groin, leaving him barely able to stand. Refusing evacuation, he ordered his only two surviving guns forward to the stone wall to meet Pickett's charge head-on. Bleeding heavily, supported by an orderly at times, he continued to command the guns as the Confederate infantry advanced across the open fields. When gunners fell, he took their place, sighting and firing the pieces himself. "I'll give them one more shot," he is recorded as saying. Moments later, while aiming one of his guns at the rapidly approaching line, he was struck in the mouth by a bullet that killed him instantly. He died beside his cannon, still directing the fire in the decisive moment of the battle. So for John Vermillion, this is it. Right there is where Armistead goes down. Somewhere out here in this field where I'm standing right now, John Vermillion is taken captive. This march is over for him. This battle is over for him. And the Confederates are going back across this field. What's left of them, of that 15,000 that came across this field, they're straggling back. There's no support coming, and there's no way that they're going to win this battle. Eventually, those armies go on, meet again and again, and death would continue. Finally, in 1865, the Army of Northern Virginia gives up. Robert E. Lee quits. And after that, all the other forces in the field start to lay their arms down. That's the end of the American Civil War. Now just imagine what must have been going through John Vermillion's mind when he's standing in this position I'm in now. I can see the stone wall in front of me, the angle, and I'm about to go up and over that stone wall. And as I get over the top, they're at a trot here. They're running as fast as they can to try to break these lines. Low Armistead's got his hat on a sword, and he's off to my right-hand side. You can see him just over there. Imagine. And as we're coming up over this stone wall at a trot, cannons are still firing. The men are starting to get a little uneasy over here because they can see us coming at them. And then I make my way up these stones, up to the top, and as I get up here, I look directly in front of me and I see that Armistead has advanced about 100 feet in front of me, and he goes down. He's blasted. Fight is over. I'm looking all around me. My ranks are decimated. I don't think there's any way for us to continue to fight. So as I'm here, it's either put my arms up in the air, stick my club up, and surrender to the men around me and hope they don't kill me, or try to make my way back across this field, way back over there, to where that Virginia monument is, back to my lines of safety. Because there's nothing across this field that's going to prevent me from getting shot in my back as I'm going across. So he does what any logical person would do, and he gives himself up here, right where Armistead is injured. and Armistead would end up dying as a result of his injuries, but Vermillion would be a prisoner of war. Cushing's job here is fairly simple. His job is to hold this ridge, direct the fire, break any of the enemy lines that are coming across the field, and do it over and over again. And even though he's a 19-year-old West Point grad, he still knows how to do his job. And he's doing it good out here in Malvern Hill. One of the more curious and funny stories happens right here on these fields, not too far from where I'm at, with Jackson and Trimble. And Peter Crawford Earnhardt is actually over there. And who knows, maybe he might have even been a witness at some point in time to some of this, what I'd consider hilarity, but it was a very serious situation for them. Trimble was getting his men together to go into the fight, and General Jackson's riding along the lines. And he looks down at Trimble and he says, "General Trimble, sir, what are you going to do?" And Trimble looks back up at Jackson and he says, "General Jackson, I'm going to try to attack those batteries over there, sir." And General Jackson looks down at Trimble and he says, "Well, General, I guess you'd better not try it. General Hill just tried to attack those batteries over there with his old division, and they were repelled. I guess you'd better not try it." And then he rode away. One soldier records in his diary later on that they were all very glad that General Jackson had said that, because that stopped them from having to come across this field and attacking those batteries. Now, one of the things that was in Lee's plans was he told the officers that if they heard Armistead's men yelling from across this field, a loud, roarous yell, that these men were to go into the attack, go into the fight from D.H. Hill. Armistead's over here. And he's coming out from that position and making his way back across this field towards the position where Alonzo Cushing is, where we were talking about the 4th U.S., and primarily towards that 14th New York that's out there, the infantry. When he comes across this field, there is a loud yell that comes from those men, but it's not because of something good. D.H. Hill is in conference with his men, and he hears the yell, and all of a sudden the officers spring to their feet, and they get ready to attack, and they throw their men right into that fight right behind them, thinking that there was an advantage or weakness or something that they were going to attack. But what ends up happening is they're throwing their men right into the fire. These guys come across this field and the artillery is taking legs off, knocking heads off their shoulders, flattening those lines down to the ground. And in some sections out here, men are dying in straight lines across this field. One poignant story that happens out here near where Alonzo Cushing's battery would have probably been, but a little bit further off in the distance, is a soldier by the name of John W. Lash. John W. Lash enlisted in 1861, and he was with the 16th Virginia. And he's coming across this field, and a bullet hits him in the chest. Now, for most men, that's probably done. You're dead. Well, this bullet just happens to hit the photograph of his infant son that was born in June of that year. And it hits this silver plate, or this plating that's behind it, and it makes it so that the bullet doesn't create a serious wound on this man. Well, after the Battle of Malvern Hill is over with, he writes back home and he tells his wife that they should actually name the boy Malvern Hill in honor of the time that his son's photograph saved his life at Malvern Hill. And they did so. They renamed their boy Malvern Hill Lash. And Malvern Hill Lash would grow up to own a furniture store in Newport and be a very successful man there. So here we are on that ridge line that I was talking about where Couch's men were. And we've talked about this position before in a previous video when we talked about Peter Crawford Earnhardt. Way off in the distance over there, the 4th U.S. Artillery are opening up. Coming out of those woods right there, the 20th North Carolina are coming out, and Peter Crawford Earnhardt is coming across this field, or at least attempting to. But earlier, the 5th New Hampshire are back here towards the West House, off in that distance right there. The artillery from the Confederacy has found that spot, and they're now starting to bear down. The 5th New Hampshire at Caldwell's brigade came to Couch's support with the rest of the brigade. But for a while it waited near that house just as the regiments received the order to support the battery. But then the Confederate guns found that position. Lieutenant Thomas Livermore yelled to his commander, "Captain, we might as well just go across that field under fire as to lie here, for we shall get killed here, so let us go." The captain ordered an advance and a double quick to get his men away from the fire. It was quoted, "Shells flew all around us, and the wonder was that more were not hurt." Livermore wrote that himself years later. But they would end up making their way out here to this position, this dip in the ground, if you will, where that high rise comes up over there to support this position over here, as the Confederates had to make their way across this field here. Now, it's stories like that that keep me going when I go out to these fields, no matter what the temperature is or no matter what the day's like. I come out here to these fields and I tell stories like that. I talk to people about these battles and the people that fight here. Anybody that wants to have the conversation, you know, I've had perfect strangers that don't know who I am and I don't know who they are. And they come up to the field with a common purpose, which is basically to sit here and talk to anybody that'll talk to them about the fight. Those kinds of stories connect us all to the American Civil War. And really, stories about Dale Earnhardt's ancestor and Brian Cushing's ancestor out here on this field, they connect us even closer. And they let us know that that Civil War is not too far in our past. The fact that only just a few generations later, people that would be famous during our lifetime, their ancestors are on this field fighting each other. One north, one south. One goes on to be a Medal of Honor recipient, and the other one goes on to live the rest of his life. So, it's very interesting, and I love those stories. But it's not just a story, it's a life, all in one snapshot. And you can learn about it here at places like Malvern Hill. Sometimes these dirty paths that we walk out here on these fields reveal some things. It's been snowing and raining out here for a few, and I'm walking down this path and I started to notice something red stick up out of the ground over here, right across from where the parsonage is. And who knows what it came from. It could have been a part of the parsonage, it could have been a part of a house that once stood out here before. But I just wanted to turn the camera around and kind of show you what I'm seeing out here on this field. To me, that's a real tactile connection to the link to the history on these fields. So down here is what I'm talking about. We've got some, looks like some old bricks here coming from a building. And then what probably used to be some pavement for something else, obviously. But that's kind of neat to see that old brick laying there in the ground. I'm not sure what it came from, but it's definitely old. All throughout these fields, you'll find things like that too. When you walk across the fields, things like glass from windows that are over 100 years old. Old boards from a house that were either burnt down or broken here on these fields. These fields, they carry a lot of history, but sometimes they also carry bodies. On this field in particular, Malvern Hill, there were soldiers that were found here out in those woods that were from the Confederacy, and they had to be reburied 120, 130 years later after the war. There's still people that were lost in that war that nobody knows where they went or what happened to them, and they're probably on these fields. I'm at the Glendale National Cemetery right now, checking out the cemetery grounds. Can't admire like what comes from Alonzo Cushing's battery. It wipes away entire regiments, line by line, man by man, one after another. It's not something that's to be daydreamed about. It's not heroic. It's mechanical, and it's done at a distance. It's something that can be easily done when the man's not standing directly in front of you. But when it starts to get close, like it did at Gettysburg for him, it becomes a lot more difficult. And no doubt he saw a lot of fighting up close and personal. And Malvern Hill wasn't as close. Gettysburg, that's a whole nother story. and he ends up losing his life there. Peter Crawford Earnhardt and Alonzo Cushing likely never crossed paths on any of these battlefields face to face. But their paths did meet here at Malvern Hill. And generations later, that same grit and determination would be passed down through the bloodlines of those families. Dale Earnhardt would be born and go on to be a NASCAR legend. Brian Cushing would become a linebacker and play for the NFL and make his own way. In his bio, he does mention Alonzo Cushing being his 5th great uncle, which is pretty neat. He knows his history and he knows how important it is. These fields are something else. They're pretty special, and that's the reason why we like them so much. It's not because of the death and destruction, but it's because of the lessons that these fields hold for future generations. Alonzo Cushing's actions at Gettysburg was widely known throughout the Civil War, throughout the Union Army. The legend started probably before the man even died, but he died there on that field for sure. So why in the world didn't Alonzo Cushing end up with the Medal of Honor until 150 years later? I mean, it's the longest record of anybody being posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. So when we go to ask the question why Alonzo wasn't posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor sooner, it kind of has to go back to what's going on at the time. If you think about it, Alonzo Cushing's dead. A lot of men in that artillery unit are dead. The leadership that's alive is dealing with the aftermath of Gettysburg. So they're picking up the pieces. They're trying to figure out who's available, who's not, and not to mention they're chasing down an enemy. So the last thing that they have on their minds at that moment is how many people need a Medal of Honor. So that's one reason. Another reason, a lot of the people that saw the actions at that time, that were witnesses, eyewitnesses to what happened, a lot of them died. They died as a result of the war. And then over time, it just didn't become important. People stopped really caring about those stories, and they didn't put him in for an award. It's kind of a miscarriage of justice if you think about it, because the man clearly deserved the Medal of Honor based on his bravery there at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, based on what he did after being so badly wounded there at Gettysburg. And you can even point to the fact that so many members of the United States Army at that time had been given a Medal of Honor for simply picking a flag up off the field. Even the 27th Maine, 846 members, I think, were given a Medal of Honor at one time, simply because they extended their enlistments Those were rescinded, however, in 1917 when the United States Army started to look at the restrictions that needed to be put in place for the Medal of Honor. There had to be certain things that you had to do in order to qualify for that, and there needed to be an eyewitness. So I could see eyewitnesses probably being a problem for his particular award. The revocation of the Medal of Honor in 1917, it wasn't an unheard of thing. There's a whole bunch of examples of people that had Medal of Honors given to them, or Medals of Honor given to them in the American Civil War, but then had it revoked in the early 1900s. Just to name a few, James W. Fadden in 1917 had his taken from him. He performed dangerous duties as a civilian, but it was revoked because he was a civilian. He wasn't a United States military service member, so therefore he didn't qualify for the Medal of Honor. Then there was William F. Cody. Old Bill himself. He was a civilian scout with the 3rd U.S. Cavalry. He was awarded in 1872, and it was revoked in 1917, but then it was given back to him posthumously in 1989 as another review was done on the Medal of Honor. It's pretty amazing to think that at the time the Medal of Honor pretty much was whoever they wanted to put in for the Medal of Honor, and it could be for any reason that that officer wanted to put them in for that Medal of Honor. So it's not hard to believe when you start thinking about that. It's not hard to believe that somebody like Alonzo Cushing would have been lost to time, and his heroism might have been overshadowed by a whole lot of other stuff. The year is 1987, and a lady by the name of Margaret Zerweck ends up buying a piece of property and finds out that it used to belong to Alonzo's father. And this is how she starts to stumble across the story, because she is a private historian, someone that does this for a hobby all the time. And she digs into the story and realizes it's pretty amazing that this young 22-year-old man would lose his life at the biggest battle of the Civil War, the one that everybody talks about all the time. Even if you don't know about the Civil War or deep into the history, you know about Gettysburg. But the way he loses his life, being there with his artillery pieces, shouting at his men to bring more cannons forward, refusing an order to go back to save himself, holding his own intestines into his body while he's trying to protect that cannon, while he's trying to fight the enemy that's facing him there at the angle. It inspires her, and she starts to lobby for him to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Eventually it works, and in 2002, Russ Feingold, a U.S. Senator from Wisconsin, ends up submitting him for that Medal of Honor. So now we're talking 2002. Well, what in the world happened? What happened between 2002 and when he was awarded? We're talking a lot of time there. Well, there was a rule on the book, essentially, that said that there was a limitation to the amount of time. In other words, if you did an action and it was so long ago that it was outside of the submission limitation, then you couldn't submit a person for that Medal of Honor and have it awarded. So they had to get past the red tape. Sound familiar? So they end up having to pass a law in order to get to that point, and they get past the red tape, and eventually the submission makes it to the United States Army. The United States Army in 2010 approves that award, and eventually it makes its way to Barack Obama's desk. Even then, it's still delayed. In 2010, the award is accepted by the United States Army. It's sent over for acceptance and signature. Barack Obama signs it in November of 2014, bringing an end to this long, long wait for the Medal of Honor, the posthumous awarding of that Medal of Honor. But even then, they had to find someone to come and accept it. And they found a distant relative to come to the White House and accept that Medal of Honor for Alonzo Cushing. It was a long time coming. The young man gave his life there on that field at the age of 22. And he did it in such a heroic way. And the story was woven into the Gettysburg story. All the Gettysburg historians would talk about it, and they would tell people about it when they came out to that spot at the angle. There's a small little monument out there too. It's over near where Armistead fell. It's a pretty amazing place to go to. Awe-inspiring to look across that field and think about the heroics of all the people that fought out there. But what's more amazing is the fact that young man, being only 22 years old, would have the courage and strength to do what he did. And our country sort of forgot about it. But the justice of that moment was brought back around, and he ends up receiving the medal like he should. Now for Earnhardt, there's no medal. He's with the Confederate Army. They didn't have medals like that with the Confederate Army, really. And the highest honor or award that they could get is a mention in the dispatches of Robert E. Lee, which the 20th North Carolina did get mentioned in Robert E. Lee's dispatches. So I guess you could say that's about as high of an honor as you could get. But for him, he goes on to survive this war and become one of 72 men to survive as part of the 20th North Carolina in his company, which was pretty much an unheard of thing at that time, especially the fact that he survived without a single injury to his body. It's pretty amazing. And he fought in almost every major engagement here in the East. So that's really the only tie that Barack Obama has to this whole thing, Malvern Hill or Gettysburg. He signed the award for Alonzo Cushing, making it official that he was a Medal of Honor recipient. As far as Barack Obama's family is concerned, his mother, from what I've read, has ties to colonial Jamestown. Her family came over from England and has some ties to England and Ireland and places like that. His father, on the other hand, does not. And as far as his mother's ancestry is concerned, their people, from what I can find, did not enter the American Civil War in any way whatsoever. But I'll keep looking for that information. Hopefully I can find something to dig up and talk about. Either way, it would be extremely distant relative and not exactly tied to Malvern Hill, that Medal of Honor, or Gettysburg. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our story out here at Malvern Hill and the little snippets that we put in there from Gettysburg to talk about the fighting over there that took place at Pickett's Charge. These stories really, they resonate through time. It's pretty amazing the things that you learn when you just pick up a book or do a little bit of research about these places. And I hope maybe these videos will teach you a little something and you don't have to do the research for yourself. But I do encourage you to go look it up. It's pretty amazing the connections that these fields have to modern day public figures. And I'm going to continue to search for more stories just like this. I hope you'll come back and watch some more. Your support is really greatly appreciated. It helps to build this channel up. It keeps history alive. And it allows us, history creators here on YouTube, to continue to do what we love best, which is tell you about these stories and bring these historical places to you, and also tell you about opportunities to be able to support history out there in real life, like the American Battlefield Trust and the Gettysburg Museum of History. Until next time, this is History with Waffles.